Okay, just before we start, can I please ask you to, for all of you, to turn your cameras and mics for sake of broadband. Please make sure and ensure that you are muted as well. Good evening, all. If you're based in Greenwich time or nearby, thank you all for zooming in for another Archism lecture. Tonight, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague and inspiring tutor, Max Wisotsky. In tonight's lecture titled Architectures of Rift, Max will be talking about Marx, colonialism, ecological destruction, indigenous rights and worldviews, and how they all relate to Sweden's northernmost town of Giron in Kiruna. He writes, the mining town of Kiruna, Sweden's northernmost city, is on the verge of going through a huge transformation. Due to expanding mining operations, the city is being forced to move. Through a mixture of building relocations, new construction, and expanded urban planning, the city is on track for a large-scale urban transformation, for better or worse. This piece of work, developed out of a dissertation written as part of the completion of the MA Architectural History at the Bartlett, with the assistance and supervision of Dr. Peg Ross, is the beginning of a collection of research and exploration of a new theory of ecology based around the idea of metabolic or ecological rift. Emerging out of writings by Marx and contemporary socialists, this theory can serve as a profound tool for architectural theory and criticism, and it, alongside non-Western indigenous theories of human nature relationship, can provide a scaffolding for understanding and critiquing the way that nature, sustainability, and the larger global environment is framed by the practices of architecture and urbanism. Max is a Swedish-American designer, theorist, and historian from Los Angeles, currently a lecturer and head of second year of the BA program, architecture program at Birmingham City University. He holds a Bachelor of Architecture from California Polytechnic State University at San Luis Obispo and a Master's of Architectural History with distinction from the Bartlett School of Architecture. His research centers around narrative and creative writing styles as a method of architectural history and theory production. Architecture's role in the cultural, social, and environmental ecologies of our cities, and the production of Marxist ecological theory as a critical method for architectural history. Last year, Max was nominated for Most Inspiring Tutor, and in that same light, there is no one better to describe Max as his own student. Due to time constraints, I am not able to read out all the notes that I have poured into my inbox, but here's a few. From Emily, I don't think I've been ever met such an enthusiastic tutor with every single new lecture or concept he would deliver to us. He helped to always keep us motivated and excited to learn, made second year a truly memorable year. We will always look back on second year with fond memories of our time with Max, including us getting soaked on outside visit to Digbeth and Max getting hyper after lunch. Massive thank you, Max. From Kathy, Max is a great tutor who brings enthusiasm to every session and motivates everyone to push themselves to be their very best version of themselves, as well as motivating us work passionately. He gives us the initiative to keep learning and progressing and to never give up, which has been a great push throughout this course. From Emery, what's special about Max is that he expresses humanity as much like a human as he is a designer and a teacher. Real is synonymous to Max when it comes to his teaching, a class favorite attribute of his understanding and respect for pluralism. From Amy, Max was a sensational year leader, pouring passion into his sessions to truly inspire us. He always made time for anyone who may have needed it and could not be faulted as an L5 tutor. From motivating us to delve out of our comfort zones to anecdotes about his own personal experience, most memorably, a story of hidden animals in architectural drawings, enthralling us all. From Pasha, Max is one of the most inspiring tutors I've ever worked with. His ideas always allow me to push and broaden the horizons of my work, and his supportive nature was especially appreciated during COVID times. There are many more, and I will email it all to you. But now, here's to you, Max.
Wow, well, I wasn't expecting that. Thanks so much, everyone, for the lovely words. Thanks, Bea, for the introduction, and thanks so much for putting this lecture series together and for the amazing animations and posters you've put together to put this forward. I'm really thrilled to be here today to talk to you about some of my research and work. And I'm really happy to have all of my former students, present students. There's lots of other people I'm noticing popping up in the group, so I'm really, really excited to have everyone here with me. Yes, this lecture is titled Architectures of Rift, Investigating Giron through a Marxist Ecology. In northern Sweden, in an area known to Swedes as Norrland and to the indigenous Sami people as Sapmi, the mining town of Kiruna is on verge of going through a radical change. Here you can see the city on the map circled in yellow. Located 145 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, Kiruna, or Giron in northern Sami, is located in some of Sweden's most beautiful landscape. It's just a short train ride away from the beauty of Abisko National Park, from Kebnekaise, the tallest mountain in Sweden, and it's just up the road from the famous ice hotel in Jukkasjärvi. Yeah. Surrounded by these breathtaking vistas and natural beauty is the world's largest iron mine. And it's this mine that is literally ripping apart Kiruna and the landscape it sits within. And here's the city in its very common snowy dressing. Here you can see an image from 1960, and here's another from today. The mine and its paraphernalia, like tailing dams, piles of waste rock, transportation infrastructure, and processing plants, are now the same size or bigger than the adjacent city. Here we can see how the mountain looked 110 years ago. That's 1981, and this is today. And here we can start to see the full extent of the city and the mine together. It's really important to note that the name of the town, Kiruna, comes from the name of the mountain itself, Kirunavaara, or Gironvaari, which in northern Sami means the mountain of the ptarmigan, which is a type of snow grouse. But the ptarmigan have long since been scared off, and the mine and the model town of Kiruna, which itself was built by the mining company, have drastically changed the cultural, environmental, and social landscapes and ecologies of the area. After 100+ years of mining operations by the now 100% owned mining company LKAB, or Luossavaara Kirunavaara Aktiebolag, the ground beneath large sections of the city is becoming unstable. Cracks are appearing in the roads, buildings are being abandoned, and consequently, the city center is being forced to relocate. This is due to the process of mining they use, which is known as sublevel caving. Put very simply, the mining takes place in tunnels deep underground, and when rock is removed, the ground above caves in proportionally and fills in the tunnel. As the ground above cracks and falters, the overhanging rock face collapses in. This literal rift filled with waste rock and debris is what separates the carcass of Kirunavaara, the mountain, from the city. As this diagram shows, at the current haulage depth of 1,365 meters below ground, And considering that there's a 4-kilometer long seam of iron that goes almost directly beneath the town. By 2025, the historic city center, designed by the architect P.O. Hallman, which was a progressive model town built to follow the landscape, built to respond to local environmental and social needs, will need to be abandoned. And by 2050, a majority of the town will become unlivable, and it will only continue from there. Through a mixture of building relocations, new construction, and expanded urban planning, the city is on track for a complete transformation, for better or worse. Here we can see, here we can see the plan for the new city of Kiruna as developed by white architects, a plan that moves the bulk of the city several kilometers to the east. And this is some more images of the kind of idea that they have. And this is the new city center. But this new city is still in the path of subsidence. That is to say, if mining continues at its current pace, in 50 to 100 years, even this new city of Kiruna will have to be either moved again or swallowed up by the chasm of the mine. And with the mining company's goals of increasing annual production from 27 million tons a year to 40 to 50 million tons a year, it could happen even sooner than that. There's lots of issues surrounding how the architecture and urbanism of this mining town affect local environmental degradation, socioeconomics, and the right of the local Sami community. And that's central to the current situation and its historical formation. But to fully unpack and understand what's led to this, a critical method is required to dissect and frame the relationships between the formation of this urban landscape and the environment in which it sits, in order to uncover its so-called ecological condition. For this, I turn to a new theory of ecology in architecture based around the idea of ecological rift or metabolic rift. But to do this, and before we can talk about the mountain, the mine, and the city, we need to talk about soil. In volume 3 of Capital, from a passage at the end of the Genesis of Capitalist Ground Rent, Marx writes of rift as the, quote, irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism. In response to the writings of German chemist Justus von Liebig, Marx discusses the growing issue of soil fertility resulting from the shift from small-scale communal farming to large-scale industrial agriculture, recognizing that agriculture under capitalism was no longer self-sustaining. The natural biogeochemical cycles had been broken. Nature, or what Marx termed the universal metabolism of nature, is reduced to a mere gift to capital, free gift to capital, to be used and abused at will. It's this idea of rift that represented Marx's key conception of ecological crisis tendencies under capitalism and the core of a systematic critique of capitalist exploitation of nature, understanding the soil and the robbery of its means of production. Metabolic or ecological rift is a term introduced by contemporary sociologist John Bellamy Foster. Foster's ideas serve as the basis for this Marxist theory of ecology, one which recognizes that a capitalist society, through its unwavering pursuit of more profit and production, produces unnatural rifts in the sustainable relationship between humans and the planet. Modernity, specifically as Western industrial society, beginning with the agricultural industrial revolutions in Britain in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, with its massive scale and its hugely centralized economies, can hardly be seen in relation to any kind of specific temporal landscape or ecology. Meanwhile, architecture and our other spatial technologies have only further distorted our perception of the world and our relationship to it. At the core of this disembedding from natural human-nature relationships, to borrow a term from Anthony Giddens, is our fundamental relationship to soil and a systemic, unsustainable, and inauthentic relationship with the, quote, nature within our cities and towns and within which they sit. Essentially, we've left behind an embedded and embodied relationship with our encompassing environments in return for the disembedded, technocentric view of modernity and capitalism, one in which the natural world is seen as, at best, a passive backdrop for human activity, and at worst, a pile of supplies waiting to be plundered. Rift ecology states that instead of relying on the panacea of sustainable technologies and the completely oxymoronic idea of so-called, quote, green capitalism to fix climate change and global environmental degradation, we need to instead work to reframe and critique our relationship to nature. It's through that we can recognize our multi-layered failures of engagement with our environmental, cultural, and social ecologies, and understand the degrees that they either alienate or create affinity between their local and global environments. So the theory of rift provides a critical method to understand the role that architecture plays in our unhealthy relationship with the varied ecologies of our lives. It highlights the fact that architecture as a cultural and social technology is inextricably linked with the hegemonic view of capitalist nature, and therefore only furthers in its production. In Kiruna, the exploits and architectures of the mining company embody this ecological rift theoretically, but also physically. As this vandalized poster implies, with the superposition of the greedy Scrooge McDuck and the LKAB logo, decisions about the relocation of this town seem to be made on the behalf of profit and not people. According to the architectures and ecologies of the city, nature is not part of the collective patrimony. It's not something that should be protected and conserved, but it's a kind of benign actor in the background or a source of future profits. In Kiruna, it's the bottom line over a traditional Sami worldview that wants to protect important cultural landscapes. It's company profits over important social and heritage spaces. It's ore bodies over human bodies. Therefore, this project and research aimed to understand Kiruna in relation to modern architectural and capitalist processes of alienating nature, as well as the complicity of the architecture and urbanism of this, quote, new Kiruna in framing the city, not in a local embedded nature, but through the lens of colonialism and the extraction of wealth and resources by non-Sami Swedes. As such, the project engages with three concepts of rift and architecture, and the architecture that produces them. So first is environmental rift, which is via landscape degradation, pollution, and ground subsidence, which we'll see through understanding the Mines Visitor Center, as well as this new city plan that's seemingly being designed to be consumed, demolished, and rebuilt. You then have cultural rifts via the suppressing of Sami traditionally embodied landscapes and the impacting of important cultural identity and economy of reindeer herding through the placement and relocation of the new town onto those landscapes. And lastly, there's this social rift, which is looking at questions around the economics of rent, the value of important social spaces and heritage buildings, and frankly, the democracy of the relocation. But we'll start by understanding the mine. Since its foundation in 1890, the mine in Kiruna has extracted 950 million metric tons of ore from the eponymous mountain. As I said earlier, the mountain's name Kirunavaara comes from the northern Sami Girunvari, which means mountain of the ptarmigan. But after 118 years of mining, the ptarmigan have been driven away and they've decimated the surrounding landscape. The once cone-shaped peak has practically been torn in two. The waterways have been shackled and poisoned. Traditional herding routes have been obstructed. The severing of this embodied identity serves as an analogy for the fundamental shift from an indigenous framing of nature as a co-committant entity in the production and experience of space to the capitalist one that views nature as this free gift or a direct route to profit. The resulting technoscience moonscape, the term moonscape was told to me by a local Sami leader that I spoke to when I was there. So the resulting technoscience moonscape of the mine and its architectures has stripped Kiirunavaara of her cultural and natural agency, subsuming herself and her surrounding nature in a capitalist ideology of consumption and degradation. And the mine's visitor center, which sits 540 meters below point zero, which once marked the highest of the 11 now blown off peaks, serves as the nexus of this rift and reframing. Through its physical presence and its function on site, the visitor center helps to maintain a new epistemology centered around framing nature as material wealth, which is widening the already present rift. So this space, an abandoned mining shaft come museum, is physically separated from the material world and is surrounded by LKAB controlled imagery, data, and talking points. There's a screenshot here of the kind of tour that they give. And it plays an integral role in the ontological formation of the mountain of Kiirunavaara and her encompassing environment as conquerable, promoting this kind of technoscience ideal of capitalist industry. And the term technoscience becomes a really important word here to really understand the formational power of the constructed view that this architecture promotes. In feminist theory and vocabulary, this is a quote from Donna Haraway, the term not only denies the existence of boundaries between science and technology and questions the multitude of actors, human and non-human, but also it conveys that scientific knowledge and technological worlds are actively constructed through entanglement of material, social, and historical agents. So the ontology, the kind of nature of being of this visitor center, which is itself formed from the skeletal remains of the architecture of some 500 kilometers of road that have been dug within the mountain of Kiirunavaara, presents the act of mining as a symbol of progress and modernity for Sweden and for the people of Kiruna. And while espousing company propaganda with phrases like people and pellets the way forward, alongside glossy photos of people smiling in hard hats, when you're there, you're constantly reminded that from their perspective, and this is a quote from when I went on a tour of what someone said to me, quote, before the mine, there was absolutely nothing up here. Maj-Britt Öhman, who's a Sami academic and researcher, reminds us that describing the land and waterscapes as empty of human bodies, often indigenous populations, and the animal bodies with which these human bodies interact is common language used by colonial decision makers in controlling the historical narrative. By emptying the surrounding land and waterscapes of the mostly indigenous human bodies and the non-human entities with which they interact, the language that LKAB uses aims to fundamentally rewrite the historical narrative. Essentially, if it isn't iron, it doesn't count. The alienation of nature by the system, by the architecture of this mine and the mine's visitor center as the center of it, the alienation of nature by the system is the social mechanism that allows for the continued creation and expansion of environmental rifts, such as the eutrophication and acidification of waterways due to nitrogen runoff from explosive material, increased gas emissions and airborne particulates like dust from the handling, processing, and shipping of materials, and loads of other biogeochemical and ecological effects. However, my focus on the role of the material architectures of the mine really considers the chasm of the mine. This chasm's expanding by about 5 meters a year. It's enveloping what was once reindeer grazing ground, but is now the homes and businesses of the people of Kiruna. And this literal rift is the main cause of the current relocation of the city. In the 1960s, LKAB's mining operation basically blew up as much of the mountain as they could above ground. and were forced to move underground. And since then, the non-stop extraction of iron ore from the bedrock beneath the city has sort of set this current situation in motion. As the ground cracks and falters, the overhanging rock face collapses in, and the more ore that's extracted, the more the ground above sinks, and the instability spreads. With each 6,800 ton trainload of ore that makes its way to the global market, the existence of the city alongside the tunnels becomes ever more precarious. And these train loads go constantly all day, and that's each one of those buckets carries this just nonstop exporting the ore and the iron from the mountain to Europe. Basically, they say if you drive a European car, you're driving part of Kiruna. With the current haulage depth of 1,365 meters, even if mining operations ceased today, the surface would still destabilize within a few decades. So the town has to move. LKAB estimates that a minimum of 1/3 of the existing town of 18,000 people will be unlivable by 2035. In this kind of tenuous buffer zone between industry and urbanism sits the Gruvstadparken, or Mine Town Park. In an attempt to avoid having housing and commercial urban space next to this fenced off subsidence area, LKAB and the municipality of Kiruna have agreed to build this green space. As current residential areas and urban infrastructure are unsettled and demolished, the abandoned space will be turned into an area safe for recreational use. The never-ending process of subsidence and demolition the mine expansion requires will feed the park as it follows people being forced out of their homes and businesses, every meter of rift replaced with a meter of greenery. And this is a quote from someone when I interviewed at the municipality. The park thus moves towards the city at the same speed as the deformations, but always one step ahead. So this is the first real space of the new Kiruna, the first instance of architectural planning being used to reframe the mine to the people who live next to it. Yes, we're taking your homes, but we're giving you something to enjoy. But the park also spells inevitable destruction. The park is frankly a wolf in sheep's clothing. Now we'll move on to talking about the people. Beginning in the 16th century, with the formation of the modern nation state under the control of King Gustav Vasa, Sweden summarily took control of Sapmi and began to levy taxes and encourage Swedish settlement. Lord High Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna is famous for stating, quote, "In Norrland, we have our own India." So from that point on, Sapmi was to be considered a colony for the use of resource extraction to enrich the Kingdom of Sweden. The urbanization of the heavily populated south of the country, as you can see on the map on the right, 2/3 of Sweden is above Stockholm, and 80% of people live in Stockholm or below. So the urbanization of the heavily populated south of the country is and always has been sustained by this intensive appropriation of natural wealth from Sapmi. Then in 1910, massive changes were underway in the north. In Kiruna, the mine and town were growing rapidly as the newly constructed railroad line connected the Swedish port of Luleå and the ice-free port of Narvik in Norway, which finally made the extraction of iron and other ore from Sapmi a profitable endeavor. And it was in this climate of overwhelming change that Johan Turi, a Sami wolf hunter and former reindeer herder from nearby Jukkasjärvi, wrote Moitalus Sami Bira, an account of the Sami, a book that describes the lives of Sami reindeer herders at the beginning of the 20th century. It's the Sami experience from an embodied Sami perspective. In an impassioned plea, Turi implores for the return of ancestral land. And here's a quote. Here below, a further account of the Sami is given, and this is practically the most important thing. When the crown has taken the Sami's lands away and given them to the settlers, these lands are no longer in the crown's control at all. And so the Sami have come to see that the reindeer can no longer survive where the Sami are permitted to stay and graze their herds. There, the lichens are all gone. 40 years ago, there was so much lichen growth in places around Skattavåkmi that the land was white with it. As I read these words from Turi, I often feel tears well up behind my eyes. It's the writing of a man who's painfully aware of the changes that are happening and the loss of his heritage, and he's just resigned to the fact that they can make no demands in their ancestral home, and he only asks for sympathy. And frankly, not much has changed since the 16th century, and those urgent pleas are still ongoing today and often ignored. Like many indigenous people, the traditional Sami worldview doesn't stand apart from nature. Instead, they regard themselves as an integral part of it. Anthropologist Tim Ingold refers to this as a dwelling perspective. It's an ontology of being and acting in the real world, living embodied and embedded in the encompassing environment. As such, a Sami traditional knowledge is based on a fundamental idea and belief in sustainability using this culturally imbued landscape, a relationship based on managed interaction, where economy and lifestyle supports an affinity with nature. And in many ways, this worldview, which is formed in delicate reciprocity with the manifold textures, sounds, and shapes of an animate earth, is the ontological opposition to the capitalist framing of the world. While only 10 to 15% of the Sami population work as active reindeer herders, which is due mostly to colonial laws of control of who gets to be a reindeer herder. The fundamental formation of Sami culture comes from these reindeer and the nature that these Sami people and the nature that these Sami and their reindeer bodies inhabit. Now, it's really important that I make this point, that I'm not trying to argue for a single set of Sami ontological assumptions. I'm not Sami. I've done this research and interviewed people who are Sami and looked to Sami academics and researchers for their perspective. And I'm not trying to argue for a single kind of Sami viewpoint, but those who herd and don't herd reindeer, those who work in the mine, those who are forced to relocate, or those who relocate by choice, they're all entitled to their own indigenous ontology and identity. There's no one Sami position. And frankly, the Swedish state has a huge responsibility for the kind of internal frictions that have arisen during the last century, as the state has decided who the true Sami are, who should keep up reindeer husbandry and who shouldn't. And this created divisions by giving rights to reindeer herders, but then denying rights to the fishing and hunting Sami. So the Sami without reindeer were effectively stripped of their ability to practice their culture, and they were supposed to become as Swedish as possible, encouraging them to forget their roots and their language, as is a common tactic with indigenous people across the world. But the core of Sami culture, and maybe in some ways because of that, it really does emanate from the reindeer. So threatening the cultural technology of reindeer herding threatens the very core of Sami cultural identity. And even with enthusiastic adoption of technologies like snowmobiles and GPS and helicopters, reindeer herding is still fundamentally nomadic in its nature. And in that, as I was told by a local Sami leader who I spoke to, quote, "We follow the animals and not the other way around." So, they rely on the reindeer having access to follow those routes that have been coded into the very essence of their being by generations of embodied practice. In the detailed comprehensive plan, or the fördjupade översiktsplan, that was put forth by Kiruna municipality, there's two maps that are key in understanding the relationship between sort of the mine town and Sami nature. One details the effects of the infrastructure and relocation, and the other investigates what is considered areas of natural interest. So in the detailed comprehensive plan, they talk about these Samibi, and a Samibi is the traditional community breakdown. It's a sort of like reindeer pastoralistic district. And Kiruna sits right between two of them, the Gabna and Levas Samibi. So those are the two sort of groups that are in negotiations and in confrontation with this replan and this relocation of the city of Kiruna. In these two maps, which we'll look at, we see the overwhelming pressure of the expansion of this urbanism and extraction, and how the architecture and ontology of these systems of mine and town, and the architectures that they produce, make inferior the Sami cultural landscape. So I apologize that some of these are grainy. They're taken out of the municipality's PDF. So in this first map, we can begin to see the extent to which the traditional herding routes in pasture land have been carved into small, disparate pieces by the infrastructure of the town and mine. Those brown snaking shapes represent the actual herding routes that are used by the Sami in the area, but, and this is a big but, only those that have a black line running through them are officially recognized by the Swedish government as being of national interest. So they recognize that the other ones exist and they're used, but the government won't recognize them as national interest, and therefore they have no protection. The same goes for those swaths of green. They're often discontiguous and oddly shaped. They represent the pasture land that is officially recognized to be the national interest, yet in yellow, including and connecting many of these pieces, is the actual pasture land, that which the Levas Samibi actively uses. So again, this is a bit of kind of animal versus mineral gerrymandering. So both of these integral Sami land uses of herding and pasture land have been forced around the town and the mining area. Each of the little red dots represents an instance of reindeer herding routes crossing mining and town infrastructure of railways and highways. So you can think of each one of those dots as a loci of conflict and disembedding. Circled in red is the area presumed to be protected by it being a national interest. But I wonder how protected those areas can be if nearly all of the relocation of the urbanism and infrastructure of the new town of Kiruna is happening within that boundary. So the new city hall and surrounding downtown will be placed in the currently unbuilt, well, it's built now because they've started construction, but placed in what was completely unbuilt winter grazing area that nestled the bottom of the city, which I don't know if you can see my mouse, but is this area here. So that's where the recentering is happening, right on pasture land that the government already acknowledges is a national interest for reindeer herding, but it's going there anyway. So the municipality is actively conscious that this is deciding to put mining and urbanism ahead of the Sami and their cultural technologies and their land use. And this is a quote from the document. The municipal government has, in its opinion, emphasized that when it comes to the plan's effect on the national interest of reindeer husbandry, the draft proposal contains too many uncertainties to make a prediction of how it will be affected. That's my translation. So if there's anyone out there who's from Kiruna municipality and thinks that that's unfair, apologies, and you can take it up with me later. In this second map, we see layers of overlapping colors and patterns representing the various national interests in and around Kiruna. That solid pink block represents what is of interest to the state as, quote, valuable minerals and substances, and it dwarfs the other interests that surround it, including nature reserves, firing ranges, recreation space, the airport, with the city laying completely within the boundary of this behemoth spread. Yet, if you look a bit closer, upon closer inspection, much of the area that's marked valuable minerals is actually covering a green dotted pattern labeled national interest reindeer herding. So just the optics of this map reinforce the idea that mining is inevitable, and reindeer herding can coexist with all the rest. Its pattern, the pattern of the reindeer herding dissolves into the colors and patterns of the others, and kind of, whether intentionally or not, completely reinforces this idea that it's inferior to these other national interests. According to the detailed comprehensive plan, quote, mining interests have been assessed as being so big that they shall be given precedence over other national interests. But the mining shall be done so that the impact / damage of changes will be as small as possible. So what is this document saying? This municipal document about the relocation of the city is saying that it doesn't say that construction won't take place until more research is done or consultation is taken place. Instead, it essentially states that the municipality doesn't know how reindeer herding or Sami culture will be affected, but that the city planning and indeed the mining must come first, while trying to mitigate damage after the fact, as they say they want to. While trying to mitigate damage after the fact versus having to work within a strict boundary of Sami land use, Sami land rights are, in effect, the least important aspect of the plan. So the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which was signed by Sweden in 2007, states, and I quote, Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development or use of their lands or territories and other resources, right? So we read that and we're a bit confused. Sweden is this liberal country that talks about human rights and the welfare state, and they've signed on to this declaration that says that Indigenous people should have rights over their land. So how is this happening? Well, in Kiruna, such rights are not applied because the land is not sovereign Sami land. It is state land, or at least according to the Swedish government. The Swedish government Sweden maintains to this day, and this is a quote, it is beyond doubt that the Sami people's nomadic land use has not given rise to legal rights to land, and that Sami traditional lands, waters, and natural resources belong to the Swedish state. So the Sami people who have been in this area since time immemorial, literally records of 10,000 years, the fact that they've been there for 10,000 years, but because they're nomadic, they can't stake claim to this land that is now being bulldozed and opened up for its resources. Essentially, by the state's metric, moving the city onto reindeer herding land is relocating from state land that is valuable with minerals to state land that is less valuable with reindeer herding. The expanding urbanism and relocation of Kiruna becomes just another step in colonizing Sapmi. Not just a physical colonization, but an ontological one. And that's the thing that I think is so upsetting, is it's causing this immense cultural rift. It's replacing this convivial Sami relationship of human and non-human with this disembedded one of capitalist hegemony. It's mining over nature, infrastructure over reindeer, and city over Sami. So now we'll talk about the city, both the city that exists or is starting to exist less and less, and the city that is coming next. This forced location, which is frankly, I think, a better word for what it is the result of a corporate-led move. And as such, questions surround the accountability of LKAB and, LKAB, I flipped into the Swedish pronunciation. There's lots of questions around the accountability of LKAB to the people they are relocating, to the democracy of this relocation plan and to the true social and economic costs for the citizens. And also there's this question around the demolition of important social spaces and heritage spaces within the city. I'm not going to talk as much about that. I could talk about that for a long time, but we'll be focusing more on the kind of new city as opposed to really what's happening with the old. This image here that's of the trends in the iron ore just shows you that as capitalism works, capitalism only works by producing more. No one is ever going to be satisfied with saying, oh, we got enough iron out of the mountain this year. So it will only get worse. But from its inception in 1900, Kiruna was designed to be embedded in its encompassing environment. The city planner, P.O. Hallman, whose drawing we see here, situated the town on the hillside of Haukivara, where the microclimate means winter temperatures are about 10 degrees Celsius higher than the surrounding landscapes. And as much as possible, the slow-growing trees and shrubs of this subarctic climate were left untouched and supplemented with new plantings and relocation. So instead of using the traditional 19th century systems of gridded streets in a main square or park, it really seems that Hallman looked more to the kind of meandering density of medieval towns. And as a result, Kiruna was designed as a system of winding streets broken up with all these small enclosed squares that breaks up the cold north winds. And it suits the town to the landscape and to the climate. And that was so much more important to them than making it population dense or easy to navigate. And according to historian Lasse Brunstrom, it was, quote, "It was at once a city adapted to the winter and a garden city." So alongside this really, frankly, progressive, as we would think of it today, but actually then they were thinking about how do we make this work as well as possible in the landscape before it kind of got taken over by this capitalist perspective. It was all about embedding it within a landscape that it worked with and not against. So just as important as the design of the city plan was the question around housing and the welfare of the people living in Kiruna. So alongside providing a library, a hospital, a fire station, a bathhouse, schools, and even an electric tram, which provided free transportation for workers from the city to the mine, there were art exhibitions, lectures, and concerts arranged to provide cultural experiences in this otherwise quite isolated place. So Hjalmar Lundbom, who was the first manager of LKAB, oversaw the development of this new town of Kiruna. And he was very well acquainted with the experimentation in sort of model company towns in America and Europe. So think, the town of Pullman outside of Chicago and the Krupp Works in Essen. So for Lundbom, there was no question that Kiruna should be designed as a model town. And one that provided more than just the minimum infrastructure needed for industry, but one that was designed with progressive social and architectural components. He was adamant that the housing for the residents was built with the best building materials, technology, and style. That's a quote directly from him. The result was a kind of unique typology of Kiruna house. The initial plans were designed by architect Gustav Wickman, and these houses are called blekhorn, or inkwells, named so for their kind of unique roof shape, which is kind of reminiscent of pots of ink. And these houses were designed to provide housing for families while simultaneously eliminating the need for youth hostels and barracks for the young unmarried mine workers. So the most common type of this was a 6-room house, which contains 2 small family apartments and then 2 bachelor rooms upstairs. This design allowed for the wives of the mine workers to make a bit of money on their own by charging the young men for doing their laundry and cooking and cleaning, but it also reduced the kind of wild behavior that usually accompanied the barracks of unmarried men in the shanty towns nearby, like full-on Wild West, moonshine, gunfights, brothels. So the idea that the architecture of this town was trying to provide a scaffolding for a sustainable and embedded kind of experience is really quite amazing. So these well-built wooden homes with their intricate joinery, brightly painted red, yellow, and green exteriors became emblematic of the well-designed, functional, and aesthetic qualities of the town itself. And so from the beginning, the assessment was that the ore in the mine at Kirinavara would last at least 100 years. So it put Kiruna and it put LKAB, who built the town, in a really unique position. So it required them to think about long-term social investment and focus on high quality and permanence in building and planning of the community and its architecture. So LKAB's investment in designing good infrastructure, welfare facilities, socio-spatially sited housing, it encouraged Kiruna to develop into a stable and much loved community. One, as I said, characterized by environmental and social embeddedness. As such, the fact that this model town and this idea of a community is in the process of being demolished as a result of the expanding rifts from the mine, both the physical ones and the ontological ones, makes this situation somehow more egregious, I think. So this new city, as we can start to see here, is designed by white architects, and it endeavors to build upon this legacy of model town. Yet I would say their lofty goals and their well-intentioned designs are undercut and made, redundant by the fact that they have this kind of new capitalist ontology of LKAB, profits over people, calling the shots of what's going on. So what I mean by that is two things. LKAB is funding the relocation, as is the Swedish state. However, LKAB is 100% state-owned. So this is a state-led project. They're paying for it. So anything that's happening with the new town is being framed from the perspective of the mine and the state, which sees this as one of its greatest resources. When I was in Kiruna a few years ago, I met with a local journalist and activist, and we drove down to where the new city center was being constructed. And he said to me as we stepped out onto this kind of dusty gravel next to the construction site, this is a quote from him. He said, "A lot has changed since the days of Hjalmar Lundbom. Nowadays they sell too much iron and not enough vision," which I thought was pretty profound. So it's less the people first urban planning of Wickman and Hallman, and more the profit first ideals of late stage capitalism. As such, this new town is being established with this rifting nature at its core. But in many ways, White's methods and approach to thinking about the future of their new proposed Kiruna Forever design, literally it's spelled with a 4, which I find mildly infuriating for some reason. But this Kiruna Forever design is exactly kind of what you would hope for if you looked at it for a first glance. The master plan is focused on sustainable design, incorporating nature, creating densified mixed-use urban spaces. They have an anthropologist working out of a small office that they opened in Kiruna who talks to the locals. And their proposal is putting forth a kind of 100-year plan for the future of the city, one that slowly phases the old out, creating a, quote, vibrant, sustainable community in the East. And in some ways, as a tutor, as an architecture, as someone who teaches architecture, if that was what a student was telling me their plan was, their concept was for design, I'd be, blown away. It sounds great. And the renders of this model town 2.0, as they call it, is depicted, frankly, as a winter wonderland. They're public squares surrounded by generic neo-Scandinavian modernist buildings, while children on kick sleds play in the snow, and a cable car runs overhead to the centrally located train station. There's narrow, people-filled streets lined with city institutions like a local Sami handicraft shop sitting across from the ubiquitous H&M and other modern essentials. There are little neighborhood parks surrounded by some of these transplanted Blackhorn houses and their new modern neighbors who have been adorned with bits and pieces of the demolished structures of the old city. The transmutation of the old Kiruna to the new one seems effortless, almost beautiful, complete. But this visionary future is severely undermined, pun intended, by the innate environmental, cultural, and social rifts that accompany the mine. The mine, its architecture, and the new city that is being forced to be created. So from an environmental perspective, the plan incorporates the best of the past and the future, you might say. So the new town borrows quite a lot from Hallman with this idea of, this is a quote from them, bioclimatic design with informed street layouts to reduce wind speed, which is also achieved by articulating building facades and roofs. So they put that forward as if it's this new modern thing. It's just what the old city did. And like all new Swedish cities, carbon neutrality is a major aspiration. They plan on harnessing waste heat generated from the mine, installing wind turbines, focusing on sustainable and timber construction, using efficient materials, designing low carbon public transport. And they argue that residents should have a closer relationship with the surrounding nature. And this new plan utilizes a series of what they call green fingers, which are what these kind of pink arrows represent, I believe. And this kind of big major park that's to preserve the established natural landscape. And they say that housing will never be more than 3 blocks from nature, which is really important because a lot of people who live in Kiruna, whether they are Sami or Swedish or from anywhere, a lot of people move up there because of the kind of winter sports and the access to nature for hunting and fishing and all these kinds of things. So the idea that you'd be close to nature is kind of built in to the concept of living in Kiruna. Yet that all sounds great, but because of the new town's location, which is in the path of the mine and its subsidence, with no design plan for actual movement of the structures in the future, the role of these technologies and indeed the nature itself, it does nothing to create an authentic relationship or narrow the widening environmental rift. So as it stands now, right, the money, energy, and material shipped in and used to build this new, quote, green city will just be crushed into some expensive sustainable dust in 50 to 100 years when the mine wants what it's sitting on top of. And the 50 to 100 years timeline could frankly be much sooner because, as we know, the mine wants to get more and more iron every year, so they're actually ramping up production. So through the marketing of eco-consciousness, this kind of sustainability is really just acting like a wrapping paper. It's a billboard of conscientious environmental practice. Meanwhile, it's creating a kind of false connection. So if it's green, it must be good, right? But the new plan is firmly planted in the rift-creating ontology of capitalism and of the mine, and it does little to nothing at all to question the social relationship to capitalism itself that forms the core of these rifts. While the original Kiruna was built with permanence in mind, the new one seems to embrace the idea of movement, not as an actual idea of movement, but as a cycle of demolition and rebuilding, just widening this environmental rift. I do note that, you know, there's this image of them moving a house on a truck that I started off with, but that's really, there's no planning in this new city that tells you how things are going to move. Seems an awful lot like they say, oh, we'll figure that out later, which probably means they'll just, you know, bulldoze everything. But the cultural rift is the kind of most galling, but perhaps the least surprising. The project follows the tradition of outright colonialism and doing little to create space that is reflective of Sami identity or recognizing their traditional embodied landscapes at all. In fact, the only mentions of the Sami people in all of the white architect documents, as far as I could tell, they're all steeped in a real deep misunderstanding of Sami land use and rights. In one interview, Christer Lindstedt, who's White's lead architect on the project, said, quote, "New constructions will preserve the terrain so as not to disturb reindeer herding," end quote. And the master plan briefly mentions that in 2100, when the mine is theoretically closed, as this image shows, the deformation area would be returned to grazing land and herding routes. Frankly, this shows a complete ignorance about how reindeer herding as a cultural technology works, and it just assumes de facto that a new town, mining, and reindeer can coexist, when in reality, the town's new location is putting immense pressure on the local Sami herders, and it may even prevent some of them from continuing their cultural heritage of reindeer herding because of the lack of grazing ground. So there's no reconciliation between the fact that land is being stolen, but then in 100 years, that land will be back when, you know, that entire cultural technology may be decimated by the town they're building. And I mean, White could certainly do things to encourage representation of the Sami culture within the architecture, things like using multilingual signage or asking Sami artists to provide murals and sculptures and things like that. But they're just kind of continuing the cultural rift brought on by the original colonial and capitalist invasion of Sapmi. The most radical thing they could have done, and perhaps what they should have done, is refuse to take more traditional territory to build the new city, or at a minimum, involve the local Sami leaders and community members integrally in the entire design process and production process, and allow them to say no. But sans a moratorium on building on new land, any expansion of Kiruna is an expansion of this cultural rift. And I'm almost done here. The most uncertain of all of these rifts, environmental, cultural, is the social rift. So beloved spaces have been condemned to destruction. So it seems like this rift has already formed. Though there's still hope that the new city will provide kind of equivalent spaces, but it's really unknown because LKAB is the one calling the shots. So while White Architects is trying hard to engage the community, the rift is built into the project through the uncertainty of who the real client is. Is it for the people or for the people who are paying for it? Is it the people that are represented as by the municipality, or is it LKAB as the ones footing the bill? So while LKAB has mentioned many things like that proposed central train station and cable car, since publishing the plan, they've since scrapped those ideas because they're too expensive. This is for a company that makes hundreds of billions of pounds a year. The businesses that currently define the city center were all promised a spot in the new center. So the ones that are in the existing city center, many of them have been promised to be moved, but no one knows whether they'll be able to afford or whether they will pay to do that. And no one knows whether, if their apartment is demolished, whether they'll get an apartment they can actually afford in the new city. So these issues, amongst many others, are causing sort of chronic uncertainty for the people who live there. LKAB is a massive state-run corporation with annual profits in the hundreds of millions. And as the local journalist who I spoke to said, in regard to the tragic loss of this building that we see here, the prize-winning City Hall, which was described as Kiruna's living room, even if it costs 1 billion kronor, which is about 84 million pounds, to move it, which is what they said it would, even if it cost 1 billion kronor to move, it would have been a drop in the bucket for them. If it allows us to save the spaces we love, that makes the town what it is, it shouldn't matter. It was demolished last year, and it was replaced with a sort of soulless simulacra. The only thing saved was this iron clock tower and a pair of door handles made by a local Sami artist. Part of what has kept LKAB and the mine going is its ability to keep its workers and their families happy. The city with its cultural spaces, affordable housing, and unique cozy charm is an important part of that. But once a rift is formed in that social fabric, the risk is that the population will drift away and the new city will just be left an expensive ghost town, waiting until it too is swallowed up by the mine. So to end this, this quote, urban transformation that is underway, that's the loaded term that LKAB, the municipality and news media uses for the situation, stadsomvandling in Swedish. It's really the result of a slow onset industrial accident, one that's exposing new rifts between the environmental, social, and cultural ecologies of this city. The role of the architecture and urbanism of this new plan in creating these rifts cannot be understated. Kiruna and LKAB have effectively entered into a Faustian pact to sell its mineral wealth to the world, knowing eventually it will be paid back with the splintered remains of the city center. So for me, this is just sort of the beginning. I've provided here a critique of Kiruna using sort of a Marxist ecological theory of metabolic rift as a tool to understand the situation historically and ecologically and socially. And the next step is kind of furthering that research and developing a greater depth and dialogue with this kind of theory as a tool for architecture, and how it, alongside non-Western and indigenous theories of human-nature relationship, can provide us a scaffolding for a way to overcome these rifts and to rethink, find the alternative. And the alternative is something that's already existed. So we need to engage with these vibrant and worthy cultural technologies and worldviews, look beyond our narrow, privileged Western gaze to gain distance and open up some space for critique of our current environmental and social practices, using architectural history and theory as a tool for critiquing the built environment, its rifting nature, and finding ways to overcome these rifts. And that's it for me. Thanks so much for sticking through and listening to me.
Consider yourself clapped virtually. Thank you, Max. Fascinating and rather concerning. I feel like, you know, wherever we go around the world, poking any spot, we'll kind of get a similar sort of kind of a story like this one, followed by a synthetic, like urban thinking attempt, and never really kind of really, you know, kind of looking at the issue at the core. I am going to open our Q&A and invite our guests to pose questions. We have a thanks, Max, eye-opening from Grant Morris.
Thanks, Grant.
No questions?
I'll ask a question if I can.
Yeah.
Yes, please, Miles.
So, Max, I mean, it's a great talk. A little bit depressing, though, to be honest. I'm just wondering if you've got any insights or thoughts on that, a possible better outcome.
Yeah. No, it is. I was just saying the other day that as I was going through and putting this lecture together, I've really chosen a kind of downer of a topic. And as soon as I kind of finish going through it, it's a bit kind of like, shoot, well, you know, what can we do? I think in the case of this specific case study, in the case of Kiruna, in a lot of ways, like it's already been set in motion. The amount of mining that's taken place means that even if they stopped today, the city center would become unlivable. I mean, I wasn't able to go into all the detail, but actually there was another proposed location, which was kind of at the foothills of the mountain that the city's already built on, which would have been out of the path of subsidence, wouldn't be in existing reindeer herding ground. But it was nixed by the company because there's potentially a lot of copper in there. So they decided that it made more sense to do this way. But I mean, I think what the solution is, to me, is, you know, this becomes a kind of worrying case study that we look at and say, you know, it's a really kind of galling example of what I'm talking about. But what we need to do, in my mind, is really rethink our priorities and how we design and how we plan and allow for things to be built. And one of the big things is really changing the kind of cultural way we describe our environment, that it isn't something empty that we kind of sit within. It's not this benign thing. And, some things come to mind, like in New Zealand and some other places, and I think it's Bolivia, two places that have extremely high and engaged indigenous populations, I might add, have passed legislation that gives certain natural landscape features and things like mountains and rivers essentially personhood, so that you can legally defend them against incursion, if you will. So there's certainly things like that that kind of I think would be quite, that's the end goal, is to really change the way we think about it. And in the case of Kiruna, they should just, I mean, I know it's really a kind of silly thing to say and a bit oversimplification, but they should just stop mining and say, okay, we've done the damage, let's just stop now, leave things as they are, and kind of accept the fate. I think it's really, which is really difficult, but particularly because the people who are most negatively impacted by this are the Sami people, the indigenous people who are already under immense pressure. So it should really be them deciding what can be allowed to happen. But I don't have any answers really.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, it's sort of a microcosm, isn't it, of the whole world, really.
Yeah.
The march of capitalism and the ultimate destruction that will end with.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's hope. The fact that this, for me, this idea of developing this kind of way of discussing rift as a mechanism for understanding the role that architecture and urbanism play, it just gives a kind of word for it, and a way to describe it, allows us to be critical of things and start to question whether we're doing things that are making things worse. And that at the moment, that's need to start, and we need to open up the space for discussion from people who historically have not been allowed to make the decisions, overwhelmingly indigenous populations, and it's not about engaging them in the conversation so we can develop strategies that are, they're the most sustainable communities. They've been around for tens of thousands of years. Their technology's extremely advanced. It's just doesn't fit within the technology of capitalism. So I suppose part of my answer would also be, we've got to get rid of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there's many places to start with that, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it picks up on so many social, political, ecological, environmental issues. And then when there was a machine behind it that tried to change, people's mind into a set of sort of kind of a rules and with a sort of kind of a end prize at the end of the line, it's going to take a lot of education as well, to even start a conversation.
Yeah.
Unless something quite drastic actually opens the eyes. But it is. I don't want to use Miles' depressing note, but it does stop you on your tracks, and that this is pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in a kind of uplifting way, if we try to make it positive, because, I suppose, I mean, this is obviously an extreme example, which is why it makes it such a good place to start this kind of development of the conversation. But I think we can all, I mean, I try to kind of mold this into what I do and how I teach, and getting people to just, ask architecture students to question, I mean, everyone, but particularly as they'll be, affecting the environment quite significantly, asking them, framing the way we discuss things and saying, it's not about, we can't anymore say, I want to do this because I like it. The first question has to be, what makes sense here? And that requires understanding local environmental conditions, ecology, this kind of embedded way of being, and becoming more reactive and more understanding of kind of ways of thinking. I've been thinking about this for years and years. When I did my undergraduate dissertation, I started thinking about questioning, the way that we experience space and time and nature and the environment. And I see some guests here who were there with me at that time. And I think that's where you start, is really questioning what our decisions have to do to our local environments. And then you just kind of have, in some ways, you just kind of have to say, okay, we have to have different priorities, right? And we can do that, and we can make a difference. And then that affects some like larger change that has to happen as well.
I'm going to read some of the questions on the chat. First one is from Aubrey Worsley that asks, the scenario you've spoken about reminds me of the late philosopher Mark Fisher's theories put forward in his book Capitalist Realism. Is there no alternative? I wonder, has been a part of your research, if it has been part of your research.
I have read some of Mark Fisher's work, and so, but it's certainly within the kind of, I would say, what I'm looking at is going to be kind of, you'd find it on the shelf between people that are questioning capitalism and the way that it is this kind of overarching system. So Mark Fisher's work is really important in kind of reframing and re-understanding things. I just said re-understanding, that's not really a word. And there's also, so for me, there's kind of three branches of this. One arm is kind of critique of capitalism, which I think is key. One of them is kind of philosophy, and I mean, a lot of that is kind of phenomenological stuff, but particularly around the relationship between the human body and the environment. So that philosophy often is coming from feminist philosophy, people like Donna Haraway. And that gives you this ability to kind of understand the role in relationship between kind of human and non-human. And then those two kind of play together to give you an angle in to kind of understand the system and then try and figure out ways that you can re-embed yourself to kind of question it.
Indeed. Next one is from Andy Saunders that says, thank you greatly for this. This was an eye-opening presentation. It brings the question of the ethics of mining and its effects on the community around it or further away, as well as architecture.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, this is also one of those things like, I remember seeing recently, I think it's MVRDV was doing a big project for Shell Oil. Like they were designing like a new headquarters somewhere in the Netherlands, but they were saying, oh, it's all timber and it's super sustainable. And you're like, well, maybe we shouldn't be taking money from giant oil companies. In a similar way, like maybe we shouldn't be taking money from the Swedish government's mining arm that is trying to fund this relocation. But obviously that's quite a privileged thing to do. I understand people need to get paid, but and this is part of one of the reasons that architecture historically hasn't been great about having like resistance to things, because we're not a profession that unionizes very well historically. So there's not but there needs to be a kind of concerted, there needs to be a new Congress of architectural thinking where we set some ground rules and say, no more money from these, no more money from fascists, no more money from big environmental polluters. They can find someone else to do it. But I'm being kind of hyperbolic, but then also, yes, you really need to question the role that your architecture, in the way that mining, so the iron coming out of this mine is, producing 80% of Europe's iron. So if you drive a European car, you're driving part of Kiruna. And so the kind of degradation of this community is benefiting, the construction of the skyscrapers in London and Belgium and Birmingham, probably. If it's not, I mean, the other option is it's coming from China, but it should still make you question then, like, well, what's happening in that community? And architecture is a similar thing. Where are your materials coming from? What's the impact, not just on site? Like people say, oh, well, I'm thinking about, the aspect and where my son's coming in, can I have passive ventilation systems? Like, that's great. What's the larger context? Does this building need to be built? Can we, the most sustainable building is a building that already exists. Obviously in architecture school, we have to teach you how to build before we can teach you how to build into things that already exist. But it should really, I think it should be part of the fundamental, teaching and thinking around architecture is who's being affected by this locally in my immediate environment, slightly larger, thinking about, national kind of issues and economy. And then on a global scale, where's the materials coming from? How does it affect those people? So yes, I think it's something that should really be kind of part of the questioning and discussion.
I'll read the rest. We have a raised hand from Peter.
Yeah.
Peter, jump in.
Thanks, B. Hi, Max. Thank you for that. That was a wonderful and really interesting lecture. Thanks. I mean, I suppose, and it of course may be too little, too late, as so often these things are. But I take it some of the proposals in terms of the new curricular areas in the Way Ahead document that the RIBA released for consultation purposes a couple of months ago must be a very, very welcome change of pace. But I suppose really it's a thoughts rather than a question. But I think, one of the things that faces the discipline is sort of the broader context of sustainability, and I think that's what this lecture is so wonderful at raising. Is it's not only the environmental implications, and of course those environmental implications are massive in this instance, but much more the social cultural sustainability of any scheme, and I just think it's such an important thing facing the discipline. So thank you for a provocative lecture on that.
Yeah, thanks so much for your very kind words. I agree. I think, yes, it's things are moving in the right direction, but like not nearly fast enough. If they're telling us that we have 11 years to make any kind of difference in widespread global degradation, environmental degradation, and the people in power are going like, okay, well, we'll consider moving towards carbon neutrality in 2050. Like, it's a crisis. It's the nature of capitalism to create crises, and we're kind of there, and we're confronted by it. And it's difficult because our systems of say RIBA or national governments or the Paris Climate Agreement, all these things, like, yes, great movement, but we need to go farther, faster. And then to the other comment about, like, I think, to me, the whole point of this kind of arm of research is that actually you can't discuss environment and ecology. Well, so the term ecology as this idea of environmental ecologies, social ecologies, cultural ecologies is really, really key, because all of those things create these kind of, systems that are very similar to, biological systems. You can't just pull one thing out. And, in some ways you might be able to say, well, like gentrification breaks is a cultural rift or a social rift, and it breaks up communities that then start to become something else because that ecology has been broken. And I don't think we can really discuss the environment without discussing cultural and social relationships to nature. So for me, it's just all about really questioning the kind of status quo, not even the status quo, just this kind of, 200 years of Western capitalist philosophy of the world out there is endless. We can just keep chopping it down. And we've come up against it now. And there's people who's like, well, can we just chop down some of it still? And you're like, no more chopping. Like, leave it, let it rest. We got to figure out something else out, or we're all going down. So it's, inherently, as you start critiquing capitalism, you start getting into this kind of overthrow the system vibe. But I think there's a reason for that.
For sure. And I mean, I think the other thing that someone like Chris Cornelius speaks about far more eloquently than I ever could. But but there's something in also sort of engagement with the indigenous and thinking about how they think about appropriateness in terms of what's built or what's made, that is, again, you know, as you've said, you know, it's something that has evolved over thousands of years. It's a completely different way of approaching the world and being in the world. And I think, you know, architecture, again, perhaps needs to regain sight of that, that yes, we can build monumental structures that are designed and engineered to last for hundreds of years, if that's socially, culturally, and environmentally sustainable and appropriate.
Yeah.
But much lighter touches, I think, are often overlooked within the discipline.
Yeah, I think, I mean, as just a comment on that is, whenever, you know, I think, obviously I'm not an indigenous person. I have to be very careful about putting forward some kind of, you know, monolith, which they definitely are not. And I have, you know, obviously I defer to research by indigenous scholars and researchers and things. And I think one thing that I find really interesting is some people get quite shocked when you talk about the fact that, like, you know, when the English came over, when English colonizers came over to North America and they found these forests filled with fruit and game, and these you know, plains filled with wild animals, or when the Portuguese landed in Brazil and found this rainforest that was, you know, replete with animal species and plant species and fruit species and all these things, like, wow, this amazing untouched land. It was not at all. It's meticulously managed, natural human relationship. So those were all landscapes that had been cultivated by thousands of years of indigenous technology, including how do we get what we need but not take too much, but make sure that there's more left behind. So managed game, managed land stewardship. So a lot of this also kind of goes to the direction of, like, land back. Let's hand over control of the land or the stewardship of the land to the indigenous communities that have technology that's been working for thousands of years. So there are these kind of big moves, but again, there's also these kind of light on our scale, like, well, what can we do at, like, light touches possible, to not disturb that which exists already.
Sure. Thanks, Max. That's
thank you.
Super lecture.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, you know, when you add that since 2015 or close by, there's more people living in cities than actually in rural areas, you know, it adds a little bit more, you know, sort of kind of the issue to deal. I'm just gonna, you were both mentioning on capitalism. So there's a note from Grant Morris that says, so overall, we are stating that capitalism is the overwhelming issue here.
Yes. Simple answer. I mean, what I would say is, you know, a lot of people have not been confronted with larger questions about the fact that capitalism is a problem and doesn't work. Because as a system, it's been going on for 200 years and people are like, it's the only thing that can exist. And in those 200 years, it's almost completely destroyed the planet. So it's, you know, to me, it's quite a, like, clear thing. But also what goes along with capitalism, you know, if you really want to get into it, lots of people would argue that capitalism, white supremacy, you know, environmental degradation, racism are all part of the same kind of bundle of things that go together, that, you know, imperialism can't happen without capitalism. But capitalism is the result of imperialism and white supremacy and all these kinds of things. So there are all these nasty things bundled together. And it seems kind of like, well, if you want to get rid of one of those things, you have to cut them all off. But it is, simple answer, yes, capitalism very much is at the core of all of this.
Yep. Next note we have from Idri. I think sometimes we need these jolts of shock and realization to push us into trying to understand how our questions and solutions really impact the people, community, and existing environments.
Yeah, I think to Miles's point of it being a bit depressing is so we have to confront stuff sometimes. And, you know, my partner and I were watching the David Attenborough documentary on Netflix, and it started off and we're like, what a depressing way to spend our Saturday. And then we're like, actually, this is really important. We need to question some of these things. And then at the end, it manages to be kind of uplifting. So I hope that, at first it's kind of a shock, but then as we discuss it, and I'm happy to discuss more with anyone who's interested, that actually we can start to work together to kind of develop solutions and see a way forward. But you can't move forward till you really confront the kind of issue that you're facing.
Sure. From Bullprit, we have amazing lecture, Max. It was really interesting. Do you think the city will become a precedent study so we will witness another city moving in the future?
Interesting. I think you're pretty, well, Kiruna is not the first city that's been relocated, at least in some respect. Actually, there's a neighboring town that has already gone, that has had a worse situation, maybe not worse, but the mining pit was in the center of the town, and the pit's been growing like kind of this way, and it's been completely abandoned, and some spaces have been moved. But I think, yes, this very well could serve as a kind of early precedent of the early effects of widespread global degradation as a result of the systems that we have. Imagine what do you do? So maybe a city like San Francisco or New York or Amsterdam or London, these places that have immense wealth, often taken from taking advantage of people in the global south and from the remnants of colonialism and imperialism, have the money to invest in big, defenses from the oncoming, rising sea levels. But what about other places that don't? Those towns, some of the first towns that are going to be relocated due to climate change are in the UK. So you could imagine some of these Welsh villages being like, well, we can actually move some of these buildings. So I think this is really, probably the first of a long line. But in some ways, we can hope that we learn something from this and say that not, oh, look how well white architects did in designing a lovely new city, and then stop the critique, but actually engage with it and say, how can we avoid maybe further issues in the future?
Well, that's something that this round of young architects graduating in the coming years that need to really focus their minds on.
Yeah.
From Ryan Cranny.
Hi, Ryan.
I find it quite iconic that the residents of Kiruna are being forced into a nomadic, between in quotation marks, lifestyle due to access to resources. In this case, the resources in the ground. It seems that there are clear parallels to the nomadic nature of reindeer herding, traveling between grazing pastures. Yet, the developers of Kiruna still seem to be pushing this idea of permanence within the new city design. What happens when the resources dry up or the demand for steel lessens? Has there been any discussion about that within the city? Won't they be forced to move again?
Ryan, thanks so much for joining. It's lovely to have you here. Great question. So firstly, I think from a designer's perspective, you would imagine that like the first thing someone would suggest for the new city of Kiruna is essentially like Archigram's Walking City or something, maybe slightly more feasible, but the kind of way like, oh, well, let's design structures that can move to, be either move as the mine dissolves the ground beneath, or move in such a way that it, like the nomadic reindeer, following the reindeer's nomadic cycles of moving from certain places in certain times of the year to certain places in other times of the year. I think that's where the really interesting architectural solutions come. How can you engage with, say, a traditional Sami perspective of seasonality, of time, of movement, of nomadism, as a way to be at the base of the kind of architectural solution? But yes, so I think white architects have nicknamed their project the walking city, no, not walking city, like the millipede town or millipede city, something like that. This idea that they're going to build it, and then as bits of it have to be destroyed, well, as bits of it become unlivable or unstable, you know, it doesn't just collapse into the ground, it's just not safe to build on, would move forward. But it's very much like a student project where they've said like, oh, that's going to happen. And no one's really asked, but how? Like, what technology? Are you designing the buildings to be removable from their foundations? Are you designing buildings that are disassemblable? No one's asked that. And as far as I know, they're not. They're just using standard kind of building techniques. So it's like a great stuff. This is the idea of the kind of sustainable wrapping paper. Like, it sounds great, and then no one's asked any more questions. So yeah, I think, and that's also a big question around the demand for steel, is the entire relocation process is funded by LKAB. And when steel prices drop, all of a sudden they're like, we don't have as much money, so we can't build you that cable car. Oh, but we also can't maybe build that hospital. Oh, also maybe we'll just have to put up, like, you know, it's kind of similar thing to like the Olympics, like in Rio, where they ran out of money. So everything was really shoddy, or maybe that was in Sochi. But like, they're like, oh, it's going to be this big thing. And they're like, oh, too expensive. In this case, you would argue that you can't, there's no expense that's too much. Like, what's making money for if not taking care of your people? That's kind of the Swedish mentality anyway, but it's, you know, it's notable that Sweden has some of the most lax mineral laws in the world and is one of the top places for mining. So, you know, and a lot of that is happening in this, you know, empty, as they would think of it, north. And it's all kind of upsetting. But yeah, it'd be a really interesting project to think about it as a kind of nomadic city.
Just a quick note from Miles saying that there is a guy called Daniel Schmachtenberger who has some really interesting thoughts on the ideas of questioning and the bigger systemic picture regarding capitalism, etc. Not an architect, but well worth watch, and he leaves a link note on the text chat. One more question from Andy Saunders. As architects and designers, we have a responsibility to respond to the climate impact while avoiding the risk of greenwashing. Do you feel we can fall into this trap of treating the climate impact as just an opportunity and not an actual problem to be solved?
Yes. Again, easy answer is yes. Think about it like this. The first thing that happened when, you know, currently the way that, because we're in this capitalist system, the way that the system sells us solving the oncoming environmental catastrophe, the climate crisis, is, oh, but if we invest $1 trillion, we'll get $4 trillion out of it because it'll give people work and all of this kind of stuff. You know, that, oh, actually building green buildings is cheaper or more affordable, or is, you know, cheaper in the long run because you don't have costs. And so a lot of those solutions are about, number one, like, they're always framed as being a way to actually make more money in the end, or like not lose a lot, as opposed to really questioning, you know, exactly, it becomes an opportunity. Oh, well, I'm going to design a really beautiful green building with all this technology, but actually, do we need more homes, right? If you look at the UK, I mean, we do need more homes, but then there's also situations where there's thousands of people who are homeless, and then thousands of empty homes. And again, it's a legislative thing, and you know, people need to get involved with kind of understanding solutions on a national scale or international scale. But again, this is where you have to really question, like, what is this? What am I doing? Is this building solving a problem that actually exists, or is it solving a problem that exists because it then makes someone money, in a way, right? So it is worth being critical of that. But if you do have to build a new building, 100%, you should be as sustainable, as ecologically minded as possible, but also work on widening this concept of ecology and environmentalism and sustainability to include things that are, racial justice, economic justice, equality. All of those things are tied together. and are, part of the kind of sustainable way of thinking.
Yeah, great. One question from, I believe it's a question from Piotr. I can agree that capitalism isn't the best system, but there really is no better alternative invented yet. I strongly disagree that the capitalism is the source of all evil, even though it is an argument brought up so often recently. It's people, we are the it's people, we are the source of evilness in the world. So either we should start working towards a better future or keep on blaming one another. Those subjects are way too complex to judge them so freely.
Interesting question. I'm not going to have a real full answer to this. It's obviously a much, much bigger question. What I would respond with is one thing first. If you do start talking about like solutions and different kinds of systems, again, we say, oh, an alternative system hasn't been invented yet. I would point again to the fact that there's pre-modern societies, pre-Western societies, non-Western societies that all exist now, that have completely different ways of thinking about ownership, about land rights, about hierarchy, and all of those, there's indigenous communities that have been running their communities the same way for thousands of years. So inherently, I would say that's a better system because it's been around, capitalism has been around in its full form for 250 years. Some people would argue imperialism was early capitalism, but either way, capitalism is very short on the timescale. So I think one, we have to widen our idea of, okay, so some people might say that sort of Leninist, Stalinist communism is the right answer. Maybe that's not so great. Maybe people say democratic socialism is the answer. Maybe there's issues with that as well. I'm not gonna, stake a claim on one of those things. But one thing we do want to be careful about when we talk about that people are responsible for the evil in the world is there is this kind of difference between, who are the people that are causing the problem? The majority of the world, we look at the fact that however many, a handful of men, mostly white men, own more wealth than 50% of the rest of the world. I can't say that that 50% of the rest of the world is as responsible and as bad as those people who've gotten all of that money. That's a fundamental issue. So it's also this issue, when people talk about things like overpopulation is something, you have to discuss very carefully. The biggest issue is overconsumption. There's parts of our world, the part we're in, the part that I'm a part of, that I have to recognize my complicity in, that I consume many more resources, much more space than I need to, and that has to come from somewhere. And that's the way that our system is built, is people have to produce the things that are being sold to us here or there, or what we consume. And it's, going back to this idea of ecological rift, Marx said, England has been stealing the resources or exporting Ireland's soil for hundreds of years. So, the English colonization of Ireland, they are inadvertently, shipping off with all of their agriculture and meat and all that kind of stuff, the inherent nutrients in the soil of Ireland everywhere else, and then the soil in Ireland gets poorer, and therefore they have to import nutrients from somewhere else. So the cycle's all broken, and therefore someone's always losing out. So if you can realign that to be a cycle that's self-sufficient, then it doesn't get broken. And at the moment, and until someone can convince me otherwise, I see no way that capitalism can produce a cycle that is self-sufficient, because inherently capitalism always wants more.
Thanks, Matt. Max. Just quick notes from Ryan says, great answer, thank you, Max. From Andy says, awesome, thank you, Max. And from Piotr, thank you for your comment on the subject. Do we have any more questions? Peter, you have your hands up, but I'm not sure if it was from previous or prior question.
It was B. I'm so sorry for the.
It's all right. It's all right.
I love a residual hand. They're just replete. They're all we deal with them all the time. It's part of the environment of the virtual world.
Indeed, there's a new sort of kind of a lingo since COVID stroke, you know, that we now live where it is my screen. Can you see my screen, or you muted? You know, all this
Yeah.
is now part of our
New
daily
vocabulary.
routine.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? Aubrey just say, great talk, Max. Thank you for sharing.
Thanks.
I think I did not miss anyone. I think that's it.
Great.
Yep. I don't think we have any more questions. Max, fascinating and very worrying. You know, it's always in the back of our heads and minds, you know, the issues, but when we are presented with a case study and, you know, and so many facts and figures, it is disturbing, especially because the solutions are very difficult to be immediate as they needed to be. But I am sure, especially to our students in the room, that this is a moment for stopping and thinking about and how architecture and as architects and designers you can try and respond to greater issues that the world is facing, and it will be facing for many years to come.
Yeah. If I can just make one final comment, B.
Yeah, leave us on a good note.
Yeah. I would say, like, one, you know, I'm absolutely happy to continue this conversation and answer questions for anyone that has them. You all know how to get in contact with me, or if not, you can find me. But, you know, I would say what we want to avoid here as well is, as architects, to avoid this weird, like, hero concept that we can save the world in this kind of weird Ayn Rand, Howard Rourke from the Fountainhead, like, we're the most important people ever. We're not. But what we are is, collectively, as designers, people who design the built environment, we play a big role in responding to the needs of communities and responding to things on a larger scale. So I think overall, my you know, advice to people is just question things more. Really, you know, question this. It's not about questioning the status quo, but it's, you know, expose yourself to different things, different ways of thinking, and find that place of confrontation to see, oh, actually, ooh, I didn't know that I didn't know that. And it's through those kinds of things we all develop our ability to think critically and engage with the world. And then when you go out to be an architect, you know, maybe this lecture will just sit in the back of your head and be a little like sound, and someone, you know, you'll be in a client meeting and someone will be asking to do this or that, and you just think, well, why? I recognize that you want this, and I recognize that it'll make you money, or I recognize that it'll do this or that, but here's my argument for why you don't want to do that, and here's my argument for why this solution that is creating just kind of natural space, or this solution that's leaving behind what was already there, or, you know, leaving this structure, or leaving these homes, or leaving this or leaving that, is actually better, right? So let's all, you know, as we go out into the world and become architects and designers and engage with everything, you know, put your foot down sometimes and say, I don't think that's right. And that's how we start to change things.
Indeed.
All right. thanks to everyone for coming. I'm really happy I could be here.
Thank you so much for contributing and you know, enlightening us all. I think there's a lot of thank yous on the chat box. You might want to have a quick note.
Yes,
but
I see the chat now. So.
But as a note, you know, thank you so much for your lecture, and thank you all for zooming in. We'll see you next week.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Thanks, Bea.
Thanks, Max. Think you have some friends there, Max?
Yeah, I do. I like that.
But you have a look at the chat before we switch off.
Yeah, no, I've seen it. I like Andy's idea. We should have a shirt that says "Stop giving money to fascists." All right. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, Max.